The history of painting does not begin in palaces, temples, or cities. It begins deep inside dark caves, long before writing, before civilization, before history itself. For the first humans, painting was not art as we understand it today. It was not created for beauty, decoration, or self-expression. It was created to survive, to believe, to make sense of a dangerous world. The images painted on cave walls were not passive pictures, they were acts of intention. The subjects of prehistoric art are overwhelmingly animals: bison, horses, deer, mammoths. Humans appear rarely, and when they do, they are often simplified or abstract. This tells us something fundamental about how early humans saw themselves. They did not place humanity at the center of the world. Nature was dominant. Animals were power, food, threat, and mystery all at once. To paint an animal was not merely to represent it, but to confront it. Many scholars believe these images were connected to hunting rituals, attempts to gain control over fate, or spiritual practices meant to ensure survival. Painting in this sense was not observation, it was action. These cave paintings were not careless or primitive. The movement of animals is carefully captured. Muscles, posture, speed, and tension are clearly observed. Early humans may not have had scientific knowledge, but they had extraordinary visual awareness. They watched the world closely because their lives depended on it. This proves something important. Visual intelligence existed long before language or writing. Humans learned to see before they learned to record words. The locations of these paintings are just as significant as the images themselves. They were often placed deep inside caves, far from daylight, in spaces that were difficult to reach. This suggests that cave painting was not a casual activity. These spaces may have been considered sacred. Painting there may have been part of ceremonies or rituals performed by firelight. As flames flickered, shadows moved across the walls, making the animals appear alive. In this environment, the boundary between reality and belief disappeared. Prehistoric art shows us that art did not emerge from comfort or excess. It emerged from fear, uncertainty, and the need to understand existence. These paintings were not meant to be admired. They were meant to work. They were humanity's first attempt to communicate with forces larger than itself. In that sense, they are not just the first artworks. They are the first questions humans ever asked about life, death, and survival. Everything that came later, religious art, realism, abstraction, begins here. The first line drawn on a cave wall is the origin of all painting, not as beauty, but as meaning. Imagine the first human who pressed a hand against a cave wall and left a mark. There was no audience, no market, no concept of art. Only fear, survival, and the need to be understood. That moment was not about beauty, it was about existence. From that single gesture, everything began. Long before museums, long before frames and critics, painting was a language humans invented to speak with the world when words were not enough. Every era that followed did not simply change how paintings looked. It changed why they were made. In ancient civilizations, painting served gods and eternity. In Egypt, figures were frozen in time because life itself was believed to continue beyond death. Accuracy did not matter. Order did. Later, in Greece and Rome, painting turned toward the human body, celebrating balance, proportion, and ideal form, as if humanity itself were a divine equation. But when faith replaced reason in the Middle Ages, realism disappeared again. Paintings became symbols, not mirrors. Faces lost emotion. Gold replaced depth. Art stopped describing the world and started commanding belief. Then something revolutionary happened. During the Renaissance, artists began to ask dangerous questions. What if the world could be studied instead of imagined? What if the human body was not sinful but mathematical, Perspective was discovered, anatomy was dissected, light was analyzed. Painting stopped being a servant of doctrine and became a tool of observation. Reality returned, sharper than ever, but it did not stay calm for long. Baroque artists filled canvases with drama and movement, forcing viewers to feel rather than simply see. Rococo escaped into pleasure and excess, while neoclassicism tried to restore order through reason and discipline. Then emotion broke free. Romantic painters rejected control and turned to storms, ruins, loneliness, and rebellion. Realism followed, stripping away fantasy entirely and showing life as it truly was, uncomfortable, ordinary, and raw. Impressionists shattered precision, choosing fleeting moments and light over detail. What mattered was not what something was, but how it felt in a single second. After that, art no longer tried to imitate reality at all. It questioned it. Post-Impressionism explored inner emotion. Cubism shattered perspective into fragments. Surrealism opened the door to dreams and the unconscious. Abstract art removed the object entirely, leaving only movement, color, and sensation. Each style was not an improvement over the last. It was a reaction, a rebellion, a response to how humans understood themselves at that moment in history. Painting evolved because humanity evolved. Fear turned into faith, faith turned into reason, reason turned into doubt, and doubt turned into expression. This video is not just about art styles. It is about how humans have seen the world, lost it, questioned it, and tried to rebuild it again and again on canvas. From cave walls to abstraction, painting is the silent record of human consciousness, and to understand its styles is to understand ourselves. Ancient Egyptian art was never created to capture a moment in time. It was created to defeat time itself. For the Egyptians, life on earth was only a preparation for eternity, and art existed to make that eternity possible. Every painting, every symbol, every rigid pose served a single purpose: to preserve order, identity, and the soul beyond death. Beauty was secondary, meaning was everything. Unlike prehistoric art, which reacted to fear and survival, Egyptian art followed strict rules. These rules lasted for thousands of years with almost no change. Human figures were drawn in a specific way: the head and legs in profile, the torso facing forward, the eyes shown from the front. This was not a lack of skill. It was a conscious system. Each body part was shown from its most recognizable angle so that nothing essential would be lost. A complete image meant a complete existence in the afterlife. Scale in Egyptian painting was symbolic, not realistic. Pharaohs were painted larger than servants, gods larger than humans. Size represented importance, not physical reality. Perspective did not exist because the goal was not to recreate how the world looked, but how it should eternally be. Art was a visual language of hierarchy and cosmic order, known as Ma'at, the balance that held the universe together. To break artistic rules was to risk breaking that balance. Color also carried meaning. Skin tones, clothing, and objects followed symbolic logic rather than observation. Gods could appear with blue or green skin to represent divinity, fertility, or rebirth. Gold symbolized immortality. Black represented both death and regeneration, reflecting the fertile soil of the Nile. Egyptian paintings were not windows into daily life. They were instructions for the soul. Tombs were the primary canvas of Egyptian art. Walls were covered with scenes of agriculture, banquets, music, and rituals. These were not memories, they were guarantees. The belief was simple: if it existed in art, it would exist in the afterlife. A painted servant would serve. Painted food would nourish. Painted gods would protect. Art functioned as reality itself. Emotion was deliberately restrained. Faces are calm, expressions controlled. Drama had no place in a system built on eternity. Movement was limited. Everything feels frozen in a perfect state. This timeless stillness was intentional. Egyptian art was designed not to age, not to evolve, not to change, because change meant decay. Ancient Egyptian art shows us a radical idea. Art does not have to imitate life to control it. It can replace it. While later civilizations chased realism and emotion, Egypt chose permanence and order. Their art tells us how humanity once believed that images could outlast death and make immortality visible. Classical Greek and Roman art marked a decisive turning point in the history of painting and visual culture. For the first time, art was no longer created primarily to survive, to serve gods blindly, or to preserve eternity. It was created to understand the human being. Greek artists believed that the world could be measured, studied, and perfected, and art became the tool through which this belief was expressed. Painting and sculpture were guided by reason, proportion, and balance. The human body was no longer something to fear or hide. It became the central subject. Greek art was built on the idea of idealism. Painters and artists did not aim to copy reality exactly as it appeared. Instead, they searched for the perfect version of it. Bodies were harmonious, muscles controlled, movements balanced. Even scenes of conflict or struggle were composed with clarity and calm. Emotion existed, but it was restrained by order. This reflected the Greek worldview, the belief that beauty was mathematical, that nature followed rules, and that humans were capable of understanding them. Art was a form of philosophy made visible. Unlike Egyptian art, Greek painting embraced observation. Artists studied anatomy, movement, and space. They experimented with early forms of shading, depth, and foreshortening. Figures began to overlap. Scenes gained a sense of environment. Although many Greek paintings are lost today, their influence survives through descriptions, copies, and Roman adaptations. What mattered most was not permanence, but harmony. Art was allowed to evolve because truth itself was believed to be discoverable. When Rome absorbed Greek culture, it transformed it. Roman art kept Greek techniques but changed the intention. Where Greeks idealized, Romans documented. Roman wall paintings and frescoes depicted architecture, landscapes, daily life, and real individuals. Portraits became brutally honest. Wrinkles, scars, and aging were not hidden. They were emphasized. This realism reflected Roman values, authority, legacy, ancestry, and power. A Roman portrait was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be recognizable and undeniable. Roman painters also expanded illusion. Walls were painted to look like windows, opening into distant landscapes or grand architectural spaces. Perspective became more practical. Art was used to manipulate space, to impress, and to demonstrate wealth and control. Unlike the timeless stillness of Egypt, Roman art accepted time. It showed aging faces, historical events, and personal identity. Together, Greek and Roman art shifted the purpose of painting. Art was no longer magic, ritual, or eternal instruction. It became investigation. Observation replaced symbolism. The human being replaced the god as the measure of all things. This shift would later make the Renaissance possible. But even on its own, classical art established something irreversible: the idea that reality could be understood, organized, and represented through human reason. If prehistoric art asked how to survive, and Egyptian art asked how to live forever, Greek and Roman art asked a new question: what does it mean to be human? Byzantine art represents a dramatic reversal in the history of painting. After the classical world embraced observation, proportion, and the human body, Byzantine artists deliberately turned away from realism. This was not a loss of knowledge. It was a choice. In the Byzantine worldview, reality was not something to be studied or admired. It was something to be transcended. Art no longer existed to describe the physical world, but to point beyond it, toward the divine. In Byzantine painting, especially icons and mosaics, the human figure loses weight and depth. Bodies appear flat, faces are elongated, eyes are large, still and penetrating. Backgrounds dissolve into fields of gold. This was intentional. Gold did not represent a place or a time. It represented eternity. By removing shadows and perspective, Byzantine artists removed the illusion of space, reminding the viewer that this was not the world of flesh, but the world of spirit. Emotion in Byzantine art is restrained, almost frozen. Figures do not smile. They do not react. They exist in a state of calm authority. This was not emotional emptiness. It was spiritual control. Byzantine theology believed that uncontrolled emotion belonged to the earthly realm. Art, therefore, had to reflect divine order, not human impulse. Icons were not portraits. They were presences. To look at an icon was not to observe an image, but to enter a relationship with the sacred. Rules governed everything: how Christ was depicted, how saints were positioned, how gestures were made. None of this was left to personal expression. Individual creativity was considered dangerous. The artist was not meant to invent, but to transmit. Byzantine painters saw themselves as servants, not creators. Their goal was accuracy of meaning, not originality of form. To change the image too much was to risk distorting truth itself. Perspective, as developed by the Greeks and Romans, was rejected. Instead, Byzantine art often used reverse perspective, where lines expand toward the viewer rather than recede. This creates an unsettling effect. The painting does not open into a space you can enter. It reaches outward, confronting you. The viewer is not a spectator. The viewer is being addressed. Byzantine art reminds us that realism is not the natural destination of art. It is only one path. When belief became more important than observation, art adapted. Painting stopped asking what the world looks like and began asking what the soul needs to see. This rejection of realism would dominate Eastern Christian art for centuries and deeply influence medieval Europe. If Greek and Roman art celebrated humanity, Byzantine art humbled it. It stripped away the body to reveal faith. It froze time to suggest eternity. And in doing so, it proves that art always reflects not how people see the world, but what they believe the world truly is. History remembers Caravaggio as a revolutionary genius, a painter who dragged sacred art out of heaven and forced it to walk among ordinary, flawed, painfully human people. His shadows were darker, his saints were dirtier, his violence felt uncomfortably real, and for centuries his name has echoed through museums, textbooks, and the collective memory of Western art. But history is rarely a neutral witness. In the same turbulent era, under the same heavy Baroque shadows, another painter was working with equal intensity, equal technical mastery, and perhaps even greater emotional fury. Her name was Artemisia Gentileschi. She mastered the same dramatic light, the same brutal realism, the same psychological tension that made Caravaggio famous. Yet for generations, her story was pushed to the margins. Her achievements softened, her presence treated as an exception rather than a force. This raises a more unsettling question than the usual debates about artistic genius. What if the story of art is not only about talent? What if it is also about permission? Who was allowed to be seen? Who was allowed to be heard? And who history quietly chose to place in the shadows? Because when we look closely at the lives of Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi, we are not simply comparing two painters. We are confronting a deeper tension between brilliance and recognition, between skill and visibility, between those who shocked the world and those who had to fight just to stand inside it. And once you begin to see that pattern, the past starts to look far less innocent than we were taught to believe. Throughout most of recorded history, male painters did not necessarily dominate because they were more talented. They dominated because they had something far more powerful than talent: access. Access to formal training, access to workshops, access to wealthy patrons, and perhaps most importantly, access to visibility. For centuries, the structure of the art world was built in a way that quietly favored men at every critical step. Art academies across Europe often refused to admit women, especially in earlier periods. Without academy training, mastering anatomy, particularly the study of the nude human body, which was considered essential for serious historical painting, became almost impossible. Male artists could attend life drawing classes freely. Female artists were often barred from even entering the room. Workshops told a similar story. In Renaissance and Baroque Europe, artistic skill was usually transmitted through apprenticeships. Boys and young men could be placed inside established studios where they learned technique, built connections, and slowly entered professional networks. Women, unless born into artistic families, were usually locked outside this system. Talent without mentorship rarely survives in a competitive cultural economy. Patronage reinforced the same imbalance. Powerful institutions, the church, royal courts, wealthy merchants, overwhelmingly commissioned male artists, not always because female artists lacked ability, but because reputation itself was gendered. Trust, authority, and public visibility were historically coded as masculine traits. When a large altar painting or state portrait was needed, patrons tended to choose the safer, more socially accepted option. Even reputation after death followed unequal rules. Male artists were more frequently documented by early art historians such as Giorgio Vasari, whose writings helped shape the canon of Western art. Inclusion in these early histories mattered enormously. It meant preservation, copying, teaching, and long-term memory. Exclusion, on the other hand, often meant gradual disappearance. Over time, these structural advantages compounded. Each generation of recognized male masters trained new male students, received major commissions, and secured their place in the narrative of art history. While the structure of the art world favored men for centuries, women did not disappear from the history of painting. They persisted, often quietly, often against resistance, and often without the institutional support that elevated many of their male contemporaries. Their stories reveal not an absence of talent, but a pattern of constrained visibility. Some of the earliest known female painters were already working in the ancient world. Aia of Cyzicus, active in the Roman period, was praised by classical writers for her speed, precision, and ability to rival male portraitists. Remarkably, sources suggest she commanded higher prices than many of her male peers. And yet, like many women artists of antiquity, most of her actual works have not survived, leaving her reputation suspended largely in text rather than in preserved canvases. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the situation became both more promising and more complicated. Sofonisba Anguissola emerged in 16th century Italy as one of the first women to gain international recognition. Unlike many women of her time, she received humanist education and court patronage, eventually serving as a court painter to the Spanish monarchy. Her success demonstrated that when access barriers were partially lifted, women could compete at the highest artistic levels. Then came Artemisia Gentileschi, perhaps the most striking example of both extraordinary talent and structural resistance. Trained in the dramatic realism associated with Caravaggio's Circle, Artemisia produced works of intense psychological and physical power. Her paintings, particularly scenes like Judith slaying Holofernes, displayed a level of emotional force that modern scholars increasingly recognize as equal to many leading Baroque masters. Yet for centuries, her work was often overshadowed or interpreted primarily through the lens of her personal life. rather than her technical mastery. A pattern rarely applied with the same intensity to male painters. The 17th century also saw artists like Fede Galizia and Judith Leister producing refined, technically sophisticated works that circulated within professional markets. Judith Leister, for example, was successful enough in her lifetime to maintain an independent workshop in the Dutch Republic. However, after her death, several of her paintings were misattributed to the far more famous Frans Hals. Only centuries later were art historians able to correctly restore her authorship. A quiet reminder of how easily artistic credit could shift when historical documentation favored established male names. Moving into the 18th century, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun achieved remarkable prominence as a portraitist at the court of Marie Antoinette. Her technical fluency, psychological sensitivity, and prolific output made her one of the most successful portrait painters of her generation. Yet even at the height of her career, she navigated a professional world that constantly framed her success as exceptional, not as evidence that the broader system itself might be uneven. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, artists like Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt became central figures in the Impressionist movement. Their brushwork, compositional innovation, and modern subject matter placed them firmly inside one of the most influential artistic revolutions in Western history. And yet, even within Impressionism, critical narratives for decades tended to foreground their male colleagues more prominently. What becomes clear across these centuries is not a simple story of exclusion or inclusion, but a pattern of uneven amplification. Women were present, women were skilled, women were sometimes even celebrated in their lifetimes. But the long-term machinery of historical memory, museums, textbooks, major retrospectives, and early art historical writing often preserved male artistic lineages more consistently. In recent decades, art historians have begun re-examining these patterns with increasing care. Archives have been reopened, attributions have been corrected, forgotten works have resurfaced, and slowly the map of art history has started to look more complex than earlier generations assumed. Because the deeper truth may be this: the history of painting was never shaped by talent alone. It was shaped by who was trained, who was commissioned, who was documented, and ultimately, who was remembered. For centuries, the debate was framed too simply. People asked whether male painters were greater, more innovative, more influential. But that question, while dramatic, may have been pointing in the wrong direction all along. Because when we look carefully at the structure of the art world across history, the pattern that emerges is not purely one of superior talent. It is a pattern of unequal conditions. Inequality in art was rarely loud. It did not always announce itself openly. Instead, it worked quietly through institutions, traditions, and expectations that shaped who could study, who could train, who could receive major commissions, and ultimately, whose names would be repeated across generations. Access to academies, permission to study the human body, entry into professional workshops, and the trust of elite patrons, these were not distributed evenly, and over time, small advantages compound into historical dominance. This does not mean the great male masters were not extraordinary. Many of them undeniably transformed the visual language of their time. But brilliance does not develop in a vacuum. It grows inside systems that either nourish it or restrict it. When one group consistently receives broader training, stronger patronage networks, and more reliable historical documentation, the long-term outcome begins to reflect structure as much as individual genius. What makes this history particularly complex is that inequality in art was rarely absolute. Women did succeed. Some gained court positions, some ran workshops, some achieved international recognition during their lifetimes. but their successes often required unusual circumstances. Supportive families, rare patrons willing to take risks, or exceptional personal resilience. In other words, the path was not closed, but it was undeniably narrower. Over generations, this uneven landscape shaped the artistic canon that museums and textbooks later presented as neutral history. Names repeated in early art historical writing became anchors of cultural memory. Names omitted slowly faded from collective awareness. The result was not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy, but a powerful form of historical momentum. Today, as scholars revisit archives and reattribute forgotten works, the picture of art history is becoming more layered and more honest. The question is no longer simply, who painted better? The more revealing question is this: how many brilliant voices required extraordinary effort just to stand in the same room as their peers? Because inequality in art was never only about skill, it was about access. It was about visibility. It was about which talents were amplified and which were left to fight the gravity of silence. And once you begin to see that pattern, the old story of artistic greatness becomes something far more complicated and far more human. And yet, the story of art history is not only a story of imbalance, it is also, slowly and unevenly, a story of expanding equality. Over the past 2 centuries, many of the structural barriers that once restricted women artists have begun to weaken, sometimes quietly, sometimes through deliberate cultural shifts that reshaped the creative world. By the 19th century, more women were gaining entry into formal art education. Academies that had once been closed began, often reluctantly, to open their doors. Life-drawing classes, long considered off-limits, gradually became more accessible. The professional studio, once an almost exclusively male domain, started to include a broader range of voices. These changes did not happen overnight, and they were far from universal, but they marked an important turning point. The 20th century accelerated this transformation. As modern art movements disrupted traditional hierarchies, the definition of artistic legitimacy itself began to evolve. Women artists were no longer confined to a narrow set of acceptable subjects. They entered avant-garde circles, experimental movements, and international exhibitions. Figures such as Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt were increasingly recognized not as exceptions, but as central participants in the Impressionist revolution. Later generations would push even further, challenging not only who could paint, but how art itself should be understood. Institutional change also played a crucial role. Museums, universities, and scholarly communities began reassessing earlier omissions. Lost attributions were corrected. Major retrospectives were organized. Archives were reopened with fresh questions. What had once appeared to be a fixed canon of artistic greatness slowly revealed itself to be more flexible and more incomplete than earlier historians assumed. In the contemporary art world, the landscape is more balanced than at any previous point in recorded history. Women graduate from art schools in large numbers. They lead major exhibitions. They shape global visual culture in painting, installation, digital media, and beyond. The barriers have not disappeared entirely. No cultural system becomes perfectly equal overnight. But the distance between opportunity and recognition has narrowed in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in earlier centuries. Perhaps the most important shift is not only institutional but psychological. The question is no longer whether women can stand among the great painters of history. That question has already been answered many times over. The deeper conversation today is about how we read the past, how we define artistic importance, and how carefully we examine the structures that shaped cultural memory in the first place. Because equality in art is not a single moment of arrival. It is an ongoing process, a gradual widening of the frame through which we choose to see creativity, genius, and historical legacy. And as that frame continues to expand, the story of art becomes richer, more complex, and far closer to the full human reality it always contained. Istasyon video nu tam viral pe. Ancient worlds were not shaped only by kings, emperors, or generals. They were sustained by vast populations who neither ruled nor rebelled. Most people in ancient civilizations did not actively support the systems they lived under, but neither did they challenge them. This quiet majority formed the invisible foundation of empires. Power in the ancient world did not depend on constant persuasion. It depended on resignation, when people believe that their role is fixed, that hierarchy is natural, and that suffering is inevitable. Intervention feels pointless. This belief was reinforced through tradition, ritual, and repetition. Laws were presented as ancient, customs as eternal, and authority as divinely ordered. In such an environment, doing nothing felt like alignment with reality rather than submission. The majority did not need to be convinced. They only needed to adapt. Empires expanded not because everyone agreed with them, but because few disrupted them. When conquest occurred, it was often met not with rebellion but with accommodation. New rulers replaced old ones, and daily life continued. The absence of widespread resistance allowed domination to appear stable and permanent. This is why ancient empires often collapsed suddenly rather than gradually. They seemed strong until the moment silence broke. History remembers the names of emperors and conquerors, but it rarely records the millions who adjusted their lives quietly to each new order. Yet it was this adjustment that made rule possible. Slavery, forced labor, and inequality did not survive solely through violence. They survived because they became ordinary. When injustice becomes routine, it stops demanding justification, and silence becomes habitual. People learned where not to speak, what not to question, and how to remain unnoticed. This invisibility was often a survival strategy, but survival has consequences. When an entire population learns to endure rather than interrupt, the system no longer needs to prove itself. It simply continues. The quiet majority did not design ancient cruelty, but it allowed cruelty to feel structural rather than exceptional. This distinction matters because what feels structural is rarely challenged. The ancient world teaches us that history does not require universal belief. It requires collective stillness. When enough people decide that adaptation is safer than disruption, power becomes inevitable. And inevitability is the most powerful illusion of all. Religion has often served as a language for uncertainty, but it has also functioned as a structure for restraint. When belief moves from personal meaning to collective order, it begins to define not only what people think, but how far they are allowed to act. In many historical societies, religious frameworks transformed fear into obedience by presenting existing conditions as necessary, divinely approved, or morally justified. When suffering is explained as fate, trial, or cosmic balance, intervention starts to feel inappropriate. Challenging injustice becomes equivalent to challenging order itself. This reframing is powerful because it relocates responsibility away from human choice and into a higher authority. People are no longer asked to decide what is right. They are asked to accept what is given. Fear plays a central role in this process. Not only fear of punishment, but fear of meaninglessness, exclusion, and spiritual consequence. When belief systems promise order in exchange for submission, non-intervention begins to feel safe. Silence is no longer weakness, it becomes humility. Withdrawal is no longer avoidance, it becomes faith. In such environments, people do not remain passive because they are indifferent. They remain passive because acting feels dangerous, not only socially, but metaphysically. Intervening risks more than status or safety. It risks belonging and identity. This is why religiously framed systems can sustain injustice without constant force. When obedience is moralized, people police themselves. They hesitate before questioning. They hesitate before helping. They hesitate before resisting. They wait for signs, permission, or certainty that never comes. History shows countless moments where harm continued, not because no one cared, but because caring conflicted with belief. The language of God's will, destiny, or divine order allowed individuals to witness suffering while maintaining inner peace. This psychological separation is crucial. It allows fear to coexist with conscience without producing action. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized. People learn that restraint is virtue, that endurance is strength, and that patience will be rewarded later. This promise of future justice weakens the urgency of present intervention. When wrongs are framed as temporary in a cosmic timeline, there is no need to disrupt them now. Non-intervention becomes an act of trust rather than avoidance. But history records the cost of this trust. Systems that hide behind sacred narratives rarely collapse from disbelief. They collapse when fear loosens its grip and people remember that moral responsibility cannot be delegated. When belief silences action, it ceases to guide conscience and begins to replace it. In this way, religion does not suppress intervention through force, but through meaning, and meaning, once accepted, is far more effective than fear alone. The medieval world was not held together primarily by constant violence, but by routine acceptance. Most people did not wake each day intending to obey power. They woke intending to survive. In a world defined by scarcity, illness, rigid hierarchy, and divine judgment, withdrawal often felt like wisdom rather than surrender. Peasants, craftsmen, and minor clergy learned quickly that visibility was dangerous. Speaking too loudly, questioning too openly, or standing out in any way invited attention, and attention invited punishment. Over time, this produced a culture where retreat became a daily strategy. Not rebellion, but endurance shaped medieval life. Individuals adjusted themselves to systems they could not influence. They lowered expectations, restricted hope, and focused on the immediate rhythms of work, prayer, and family. This was not because people believed the system was just, but because imagining alternatives felt unrealistic. When authority is framed as ancient and unchangeable, resistance appears childish rather than brave. Feudal loyalty, religious hierarchy, and social immobility were reinforced not only by force but by repetition. People were born into roles and died within them, and continuity itself became proof of legitimacy. Suffering was interpreted as part of the human condition rather than the result of political design. This interpretation softened anger and redirected frustration inward. Those who suffered most often blamed themselves rather than the structure above them. Daily withdrawal took many forms: avoiding conflict, remaining silent in public spaces, accepting unfair judgment, or witnessing cruelty without comment. These small acts of retreat accumulated. They created a social atmosphere where injustice did not shock, but persistence did. Moral life narrowed. People learned not to ask whether something was right, but whether it was survivable. When endurance becomes the primary virtue, change becomes the primary threat. This is why medieval systems endured for centuries with relatively little disruption. They were not stable because they were humane, but because they trained people to withdraw rather than confront. History remembers revolts and heresies because they were exceptional. The ordinary medieval experience was one of quiet adjustment, and this adjustment mattered. It allowed power to operate without constant enforcement. It transformed obedience from an imposed demand into an internal habit. By the time authority was questioned openly, its roots were already deep. Withdrawal had done its work. The medieval world teaches us that domination does not always require enthusiasm. It often requires only patience, and patience, when normalized, can sustain almost anything. Modernity introduced a new distance between individuals and consequences. Technology, media, and scale transformed people from participants into observers. Suffering no longer needed to be nearby to be visible. It could be watched from afar, reported, recorded, and repeated without requiring response. This shift changed moral experience. When harm is distant, it feels abstract. When it is repeated, it becomes familiar. And when it is familiar, it loses urgency. In the modern era, people are surrounded by events they did not cause and feel powerless to affect. This produces a spectator mindset, where awareness replaces responsibility. Knowing becomes mistaken for doing. Seeing becomes confused with caring. The modern individual is informed but detached, engaged but inactive. This environment reshapes conscience, not because people become cruel, but because constant exposure without agency creates fatigue. When everything demands attention, nothing feels actionable. As a result, people learn to ration concern. They watch crises unfold and tell themselves that intervention belongs to institutions, experts, or history itself. This delegation of responsibility is subtle but powerful. It allows individuals to remain morally intact while remaining inactive. The spectator era also dissolves accountability. When millions witness the same injustice, each person feels smaller. The crowd becomes a shield. No single voice feels necessary, because all voices feel replaceable. This is how non-intervention becomes normalized in modern societies, not through fear alone, but through diffusion. Modern systems do not silence people, they overwhelm them. Information flows faster than action can follow, and this imbalance trains passivity. Watching becomes the default posture. The language of awareness replaces the language of responsibility, and moral action is postponed indefinitely. People wait for the right moment, the right movement, the right permission, but the moment never arrives because the system does not require resolution to continue. In this way, modernity refines silence. It no longer demands obedience. It invites observation. The spectator feels informed, concerned, and powerless all at once. This combination is dangerous because it creates stability without justice. When injustice becomes content, it stops interrupting daily life. The modern era teaches us that power no longer needs ignorance. It thrives on constant visibility without interruption. And as long as people remain spectators rather than participants, history continues not because it is chosen, but because it is watched. Modernity introduced a new distance between individuals and consequences. Technology, media, and scale transformed people from participants into observers. Suffering no longer needed to be nearby to be visible. It could be watched from afar, reported, recorded, and repeated without requiring response. This shift changed moral experience. When harm is distant, it feels abstract. When it is repeated, it becomes familiar. And when it is familiar, it loses urgency. In the modern era, people are surrounded by events they did not cause and feel powerless to affect. This produces a spectator mindset, where awareness replaces responsibility. Knowing becomes mistaken for doing. Seeing becomes confused with caring. The modern individual is informed but detached, engaged but inactive. This environment reshapes conscience, not because people become cruel, but because constant exposure without agency creates fatigue. When everything demands attention, nothing feels actionable. As a result, people learn to ration concern. They watch crises unfold and tell themselves that intervention belongs to institutions, experts, or history itself. This delegation of responsibility is subtle but powerful. It allows individuals to remain morally intact while remaining inactive. The spectator era also dissolves accountability. When millions witness the same injustice, each person feels smaller. The crowd becomes a shield. No single voice feels necessary because all voices feel replaceable. This is how non-intervention becomes normalized in modern societies, not through fear alone, but through diffusion. Modern systems do not silence people, they overwhelm them. Information flows faster than action can follow, and this imbalance trains passivity. Watching becomes the default posture. The language of awareness replaces the language of responsibility, and moral action is postponed indefinitely. People wait for the right moment, the right movement, the right permission, but the moment never arrives because the system does not require resolution to continue. In this way, modernity refines silence. It no longer demands obedience. It invites observation. The spectator feels informed, concerned, and powerless all at once. This combination is dangerous because it creates stability without justice. When injustice becomes content, it stops interrupting daily life. The modern era teaches us that power no longer needs ignorance. It thrives on constant visibility without interruption. And as long as people remain spectators rather than participants, history continues not because it is chosen, but because it is watched. Over time, inaction stops being a temporary response and becomes part of how people define themselves. What begins as caution slowly hardens into character. Individuals learn to describe themselves as neutral, realistic, or uninvolved, not as a choice, but as a trait. This shift is subtle, but powerful. When non-intervention becomes identity, decisions disappear. People no longer say, "I chose not to act." They say, "That's just not who I am." This language removes responsibility by transforming absence into nature. The self adapts to avoid conflict, and morality is reshaped around comfort rather than courage. The mind learns to protect itself by narrowing its moral horizon. What once felt urgent becomes distant. What once demanded response becomes optional. This process does not happen suddenly. It unfolds through repetition. Each time a person withdraws and nothing immediate goes wrong, the behavior is reinforced. The absence of consequence is mistaken for correctness. Inaction becomes associated with safety, stability, and maturity. Speaking out begins to feel reckless. Acting feels naive. Over time, conscience adjusts. It lowers its volume to avoid internal tension. People stop asking what they should do and focus instead on what they can endure. This internal recalibration has historical consequences. When entire populations adopt inaction as identity, systems gain resilience without legitimacy. They no longer need to justify themselves because they are no longer being questioned. Identity does the work that enforcement once did. This is how injustice persists even when it is recognized. People know something is wrong, but their sense of self prevents intervention. They are not indifferent. They are constrained by who they believe they are. History often misreads this as apathy, but it is more precise to call it adaptation. The cost of adaptation is slow and difficult to measure. It is paid in eroded responsibility and delayed accountability. When inaction becomes identity, change does not fail because people disagree. It fails because they no longer see action as part of themselves. This is one of history's quietest transformations and one of its most enduring, because systems rarely fear anger. They fear the moment when people rediscover that identity is not fixed and that silence was always a choice. Fear rarely announces itself as fear. Instead, it disguises itself as calculation. People do not usually say, "I am afraid." They say, "It's not worth the risk," or "This won't change anything," or "I have too much to lose." In this way, fear becomes arithmetic. The mind begins to measure outcomes rather than values. It compares personal cost to uncertain impact and almost always arrives at the same conclusion. Doing nothing is safer. This calculation feels rational because it uses numbers instead of emotions. One voice versus many consequences. One action versus possible punishment. One moment of courage versus a lifetime of stability. When framed this way, inaction appears intelligent rather than cowardly. The problem is not that people miscalculate. The problem is what they choose to count. The cost of speaking is immediate and personal. The cost of silence is distant and shared. Because the damage of inaction is spread across time and across people, it feels lighter than it is. This distortion allows fear to pass as logic. The question, "What will happen to me if I act?" overwhelms the question, "What will happen if no one does?" Fear also exploits probability. People tell themselves that intervention is unlikely to succeed, but punishment is highly likely. This asymmetry reinforces withdrawal. Even when history shows that change always begins with improbability, the individual experience feels different. The first voice always feels alone. This loneliness amplifies risk calculation. The mind assumes isolation where none yet exists. As a result, people wait. They wait for safety in numbers. They wait for certainty. They wait for permission. But permission rarely arrives because everyone is performing the same silent math. Fear also benefits from comparison. People look around and see others staying still. This confirms the calculation. If no one else is acting, then not acting must be reasonable. Silence becomes evidence. Fear does not need to threaten. It only needs to suggest consequences. The imagination does the rest, constructing scenarios of loss, rejection, or harm. These imagined outcomes often exceed real danger, but they feel real enough to stop action. Over time, this arithmetic becomes automatic. People no longer consciously weigh options. They instinctively choose the path of least exposure. This instinct feels natural, but it is learned. It is reinforced each time silence avoids immediate cost. But history does not operate on short-term accounting. It records cumulative effects. When millions make the same small calculation, the result is massive continuity. The silent mathematics of fear does not produce dramatic moments. It produces stability for systems and paralysis for conscience. It ensures that injustice does not need defenders, only careful accountants. This is why fear is so effective. It does not command. It convinces. It does not force silence. It proves it, and once silence feels logical, it no longer feels like fear at all. Silence is not instinctive, it is learned. People are not born knowing when to stay quiet. They are taught slowly and repeatedly that some truths are dangerous and some questions are inappropriate. This teaching rarely happens through direct instruction. It happens through reaction. A child speaks honestly and is corrected. A student questions authority and is discouraged. An individual challenges a norm and is isolated. Over time, these moments form a pattern. Silence becomes associated with safety and expression with risk. This lesson is reinforced across institutions. Families teach silence by rewarding obedience and punishing disruption. Schools teach it by valuing compliance over curiosity. Workplaces teach it by linking security to conformity. Religious and cultural structures teach it by framing restraint as virtue and doubt as weakness. In each setting, the message is subtle but consistent. Survival depends on knowing when not to speak. What makes this process effective is that it rarely feels oppressive. It is presented as maturity, politeness, or wisdom. Children learn to read emotional cues. They notice which topics cause tension, which opinions bring consequences, and which behaviors are praised. They adjust before being told. This self-adjustment is the true curriculum. By adulthood, silence no longer feels imposed. It feels natural. People describe themselves as not confrontational or realistic, believing this identity emerged organically, when in fact it was carefully shaped. This education also teaches timing. People are told not that they are wrong, but that it is not the right moment. That moment, however, never arrives. It is always later, safer or more appropriate elsewhere. In this way, delay replaces refusal, and silence masquerades as patience. The most powerful lesson is not fear of punishment, but fear of exclusion. Humans are social creatures, and silence often protects belonging. Speaking risks separation. Withdrawal preserves connection. This trade is rarely made consciously, but it is repeated daily. Ultimately, silence becomes moralized. People learn to admire restraint and distrust urgency. They associate loudness with instability and calm with correctness. This framing ensures that silence continues without enforcement. Once silence is taught well, it reproduces itself. Those who learned it begin to teach it to others, not through commands, but through example. This is how silence becomes cultural rather than personal. And when silence is cultural, it is no longer questioned. It simply exists, passed down as common sense. History is filled with moments where people did not suddenly choose silence. They arrived there prepared. The teaching had already been done. History often presents speaking as heroic, but the lived reality of those who spoke was rarely celebrated in their own time. To speak out has almost never been rewarded immediately. More often it carried consequences that were personal, isolating, and severe. Those who broke silence were labeled disruptive, disloyal, or dangerous. They were not punished because they were wrong, but because they interrupted stability. Societies tend to tolerate injustice more easily than disruption, because disruption forces choice. Speaking creates friction. It demands response, and response threatens existing arrangements. This is why those who spoke were frequently marginalized rather than debated, exiled rather than answered, discredited rather than heard. The fate of speakers reveals an uncomfortable truth. Truth is rarely rejected because it lacks validity. It is rejected because it carries cost. History shows that those who challenged power often lost status, safety, and belonging long before they gained recognition. Many paid with careers, freedom, or life itself. This pattern teaches observers a lesson more powerful than any law. Silence keeps you safe. Speech makes you visible. Visibility attracts consequence. Over time, this lesson shapes collective behavior. People do not need to be threatened directly. They watch what happens to others and adjust accordingly. This is how punishment becomes preventative. When one person is isolated for speaking, many others learn to remain quiet. Speakers are often remembered later as pioneers or martyrs, but this retrospective honor hides the loneliness of their moment. At the time, they were rarely supported. They stood without numbers, without certainty, and without guarantee of impact. This is why speaking feels irrational in the present, even when history later proves it necessary. The delay between action and recognition is crucial. History rewards speech late, but punishes it early. This time gap discourages intervention because people live in the present, not in future memory. Speaking also disrupts identity. Those who speak must accept being misunderstood. They are forced to exist outside consensus. They lose the comfort of alignment and enter uncertainty. This psychological cost is as heavy as any external punishment. Most people do not fear being wrong. They fear being alone. This is why silence spreads more easily than truth. The fate of those who spoke becomes a warning encoded into culture. It whispers that justice may be remembered, but safety is lived. That memory does not erase the sacrifice. It explains why so many choose not to follow. It is not because they lack conscience, but because they have learned what conscience can cost. And as long as speaking remains expensive and silence remains affordable, history will continue to be shaped less by those who speak and more by those who watch them fall. Injustice rarely enters human life suddenly. It arrives gradually, almost quietly. At first, it shocks. It feels abnormal, unacceptable, and urgent. But shock does not last. When injustice repeats without consequence, the mind begins to adjust. This adjustment is not approval. It is survival. People learn to live inside conditions they once would have resisted because constant resistance is exhausting and often dangerous. The first stage of adaptation is explanation. People search for reasons that make injustice tolerable. They tell themselves it is temporary, necessary, or exaggerated. This framing reduces emotional conflict and allows daily life to continue. The second stage is normalization. What once demanded outrage becomes routine. Language softens. Harm is renamed as policy, tradition, or reality. Once injustice has a name that sounds neutral, it becomes easier to accept. The third stage is defense. People begin to protect the system that harms them because questioning it would require admitting years of silence. This psychological investment's powerful. It is easier to believe that suffering has meaning than to face the cost of endurance without purpose. Adaptation also reshapes memory. People forget how things felt before. They lose reference points. What was once unimaginable becomes familiar, and familiarity feels natural. This is why injustice often persists even after its causes are known. Knowledge alone does not reverse adaptation. People must first unlearn the habits of acceptance they developed to survive. Injustice thrives not because people desire it, but because they become skilled at living with it. This skill is rewarded with stability, predictability, and social belonging. Resistance threatens all three. Over time, adaptation becomes identity. People no longer say, "This is wrong, but unavoidable." They say, "This is how the world works." This shift marks the final stage. Injustice no longer feels imposed. It feels inevitable, and what feels inevitable is rarely challenged. History shows that systems do not need to convince people that injustice is good. They only need to give people time. Time to adjust. Time to normalize. Time to forget. Adaptation does the rest. Responsibility weakens when it is divided. When many people witness the same harm, each individual feels less accountable. This is not because people stop caring, but because responsibility becomes diluted across the group. The mind reasons that if everyone sees it, then someone else will act. This logic feels natural, but it is deeply deceptive. As the number of observers increases, the sense of personal obligation decreases. Action becomes abstract, assigned to institutions, leaders, or the undefined mass of others. This diffusion transforms moral urgency into administrative expectation. People wait for authority to respond, for consensus to form, for permission to be granted. In the meantime, nothing happens. The fragmentation of responsibility also changes how people interpret their role. They no longer see themselves as agents. They see themselves as witnesses. Witnessing feels passive and therefore innocent. It allows people to experience awareness without commitment. This separation is comfortable because it preserves moral self-image while avoiding risk. Over time, this pattern becomes normalized. Societies begin to operate as if responsibility naturally belongs elsewhere. Crises are met with observation, commentary, and analysis, but rarely interruption. The more complex a system becomes, the easier it is for responsibility to disappear within it. Each layer provides cover. Each role offers an excuse. The individual becomes a small part of a large machine and tells themselves that small parts cannot change direction. This belief is reinforced by scale. When problems appear massive, individual action feels insignificant. This perceived insignificance becomes justification for inaction. Yet history shows that systems rely on this belief to remain stable. Fragmented responsibility does not eliminate guilt. It redistributes it so thinly that it loses force. No one feels fully responsible, and therefore no one feels compelled to act. This is why injustice often persists in plain sight. Not because it is hidden, but because responsibility has nowhere to land. When accountability lacks a clear target, it dissolves into conversation, debate, and delay. People discuss what should be done while waiting for someone else to do it. This waiting becomes collective. The longer it lasts, the more normal it feels. Ultimately, the fragmentation of responsibility protects power more effectively than repression ever could. It ensures that resistance never fully forms because it never fully belongs to anyone. History teaches that when responsibility is shared without ownership, it is rarely exercised. And when everyone is partially responsible, systems can continue indefinitely without anyone deciding to stop them. Responsibility weakens when it is divided. When many people witness the same harm, each individual feels less accountable. This is not because people stop caring, but because responsibility becomes diluted across the group. The mind reasons that if everyone sees it, then someone else will act. This logic feels natural, but it is deeply deceptive. As the number of observers increases, the sense of personal obligation decreases. Action becomes abstract, assigned to institutions, leaders, or the undefined mass of others. This diffusion transforms moral urgency into administrative expectation. People wait for authority to respond, for consensus to form, for permission to be granted. In the meantime, nothing happens. The fragmentation of responsibility also changes how people interpret their role. They no longer see themselves as agents. They see themselves as witnesses. Witnessing feels passive and therefore innocent. It allows people to experience awareness without commitment. This separation is comfortable because it preserves moral self-image while avoiding risk. Over time, this pattern becomes normalized. Societies begin to operate as if responsibility naturally belongs elsewhere. Crises are met with observation, commentary, and analysis, but rarely interruption. The more complex a system becomes, the easier it is for responsibility to disappear within it. Each layer provides cover. Each role offers an excuse. The individual becomes a small part of a large machine and tells themselves that small parts cannot change direction. This belief is reinforced by scale. When problems appear massive, individual action feels insignificant. This perceived insignificance becomes justification for inaction. Yet history shows that systems rely on this belief to remain stable. Fragmented responsibility does not eliminate guilt. It redistributes it so thinly that it loses force. No one feels fully responsible, and therefore no one feels compelled to act. This is why injustice often persists in plain sight. Not because it is hidden, but because responsibility has nowhere to land. When accountability lacks a clear target, it dissolves into conversation, debate, and delay. People discuss what should be done while waiting for someone else to do it. This waiting becomes collective. The longer it lasts, the more normal it feels. Ultimately, the fragmentation of responsibility protects power more effectively than repression ever could. It ensures that resistance never fully forms because it never fully belongs to anyone. History teaches that when responsibility is shared without ownership, it is rarely exercised. And when everyone is partially responsible, systems can continue indefinitely without anyone deciding to stop them. Responsibility does not disappear all at once. It breaks into pieces. As situations grow larger, more complex, and more public, the sense of personal duty quietly shrinks. What once felt like a clear moral obligation becomes a shared burden, and shared burdens rarely feel urgent. When many people are involved, each individual feels smaller in relation to the problem. This shrinking of the self is crucial because responsibility depends on feeling that one's action matters. The moment a person believes their action is insignificant, responsibility loosens. This belief is rarely questioned. It feels realistic. In modern and historical systems alike, people learn to assign responsibility upward or outward, to leaders, experts, institutions, or time itself. The phrase, "someone should do something," replaces, "I should do something." This linguistic shift is not accidental. It reflects a psychological transfer of agency. When responsibility is fragmented, it becomes procedural rather than moral. People wait for processes, decisions, or official responses, believing that acting outside these structures is inappropriate or ineffective. This waiting feels orderly, but it creates paralysis. Fragmentation also protects the individual's self-image. A person can witness harm, acknowledge it, and still feel innocent because their role appears too small to matter. This creates a dangerous separation between awareness and accountability. People know what is happening but feel absolved from intervening. The more witnesses there are, the stronger this illusion becomes. Every silent observer confirms to the others that silence is acceptable. This mutual reassurance stabilizes inaction. As responsibility spreads, it loses emotional weight. Guilt weakens because it has no clear owner. Without ownership, there is no pressure to act. History repeatedly shows that injustice does not require secrecy. It only requires diffusion. When no single person feels responsible, the system continues uninterrupted. This is why large-scale harm often persists longer than small-scale harm. The scale itself becomes protection. Fragmented responsibility also reshapes memory. When events are later judged, people recall their lack of control rather than their lack of action. They remember themselves as powerless rather than passive. This reinterpretation preserves dignity but erases agency. The cost of this erasure is delayed accountability. By the time responsibility is reassigned, damage has already normalized. The fragmentation of responsibility is one of power's most effective allies. It does not silence people. It convinces them that their silence is irrelevant. And once people believe they are irrelevant, systems no longer need to suppress them. They simply move forward, carried by the absence of interruption. Silence does not last forever. It stretches, accumulates, and tightens until it reaches a breaking point. History's most transformative moments often arrive not when conditions suddenly change, but when silence can no longer contain what has been endured for too long. These breaks are rarely planned. They emerge after long periods of restraint, adaptation, and fear. When silence breaks, it does not do so because people suddenly become brave. It breaks because continuing to remain silent becomes more costly than speaking. For years, systems rely on endurance. They train populations to adjust, to wait, to rationalize injustice. But endurance has limits. There comes a moment when accumulated harm outweighs the perceived risks of action, and fear loses its arithmetic. People stop asking whether speaking will succeed and begin asking whether silence is survivable. These moments are visible throughout history. Slave revolts, peasant uprisings, labor movements, and civil resistance did not arise from optimism. They arose from exhaustion. When daily survival no longer feels safer than resistance, the calculation changes. What is striking about these moments is how sudden they appear from the outside. Yet from within, they are experienced as overdue. Silence breaks unevenly. At first, it is a few voices, then more. Then a collective shift occurs where fear no longer isolates but unites. Speech spreads faster than repression can contain because it resonates with shared experience. In these moments, people discover that their silence was never individual. It was coordinated by circumstance, not choice. When the first voices speak, others recognize themselves in them. This recognition dissolves fragmentation and restores agency. However, history also shows that breaking silence does not guarantee justice. It guarantees disruption. Some breaks are met with reform, others with brutal suppression. But even failed uprisings alter the moral landscape. They demonstrate that silence was never consent. Once broken, it cannot fully be restored. Power may reassert control, but it does so with memory attached. The idea that resistance is possible lingers. These moments matter because they reveal the truth beneath silence, that it is not natural but maintained. They show that fear is not permanent but conditional. And they remind us that history does not move only through the actions of rulers, but through the collective realization that endurance has limits. Silence breaks, not when people find hope, but when they find that remaining quiet has become impossible. And when that moment arrives, history shifts, not because courage suddenly appears, but because silence finally disappears. Conscience rarely disappears abruptly. It is silenced gradually through a series of small psychological adjustments that allow a person to live with contradiction without collapsing under it. The first mechanism is postponement. People tell themselves that intervention can wait, that now is not the right moment, that conditions will improve on their own. This delay feels harmless, but it trains conscience to accept deferral as normal. The second mechanism is justification. When harm becomes visible, the mind searches for explanations that reduce discomfort. It reframes injustice as complexity, context, or necessity. By explaining rather than confronting, conscience is redirected into analysis instead of action. The third mechanism is comparison. People measure their inaction against worse behavior and conclude that they are still good. Because they are not the ones causing harm, they feel absolved from stopping it. This comparison lowers moral standards without appearing to do so. Another powerful mechanism is normalization. Repetition dulls response. What once provoked outrage begins to feel familiar, and familiarity is mistaken for acceptability. Conscience depends on contrast. When contrast fades, so does urgency. Language plays a central role here. Words soften realities. Violence becomes policy. Suffering becomes collateral. Distancing language protects the mind from emotional engagement and allows conscience to retreat quietly. There is also the mechanism of diffusion. When responsibility is shared, conscience struggles to locate itself. People feel concern, but not obligation. They assume morality belongs to the group rather than the individual. This shared concern creates comfort without consequence. Identity further complicates this process. Once people see themselves as reasonable, balanced, or non-confrontational, conscience must adapt to protect that identity. Acting would threaten the self-image, so conscience adjusts its demands downward. This adjustment is subtle and rarely acknowledged. The final mechanism is fatigue. Constant exposure to harm without agency exhausts moral energy. People do not stop caring because they choose to, but because sustained concern without resolution is unbearable. Fatigue convinces conscience to lower its voice for the sake of survival. What makes these mechanisms effective is that none of them require dishonesty. People sincerely believe their reasons. They do not feel immoral. They feel practical, patient, and realistic. This sincerity is precisely what allows conscience to be silenced without resistance. Over time, the voice that once questioned grows quieter, not because it was answered, but because it was ignored. Conscience does not die. It withdraws, and withdrawal leaves behind a troubling illusion that peace has been achieved, when in reality only discomfort has been avoided. History shows that the most dangerous silence is not imposed from outside, but negotiated within. And once conscience has learned to negotiate against itself, it becomes remarkably easy to live alongside injustice without ever feeling its weight. History often appears stable right before it breaks. Long periods of silence create the illusion of permanence, as if nothing could ever change. Yet beneath that still surface, pressure accumulates quietly. People endure, adapt, and withdraw, until endurance itself becomes unbearable. These breaking points are not born from sudden courage, but from accumulated impossibility. When silence shatters, it is rarely because people suddenly believe they will win. It is because they realize they cannot continue losing in silence. History's great turning points often follow years, even generations, of restraint. The French Revolution, the collapse of absolute monarchies, anti-colonial uprisings, civil rights movements, all emerged after long seasons where obedience felt safer than resistance. What changed was not ideology, but tolerance. The cost of remaining silent finally exceeded the cost of speaking. In these moments, fear recalculates. What once felt dangerous now feels necessary. People stop asking whether action is permitted and begin acting because silence has become intolerable. These moments feel sudden to observers, but to participants they feel overdue. Silence does not break evenly, it fractures. First a few voices speak, then more recognize themselves in those voices. This recognition is crucial. It transforms isolation into collective awareness. Once people realize their silence was shared, its power dissolves. The system loses its greatest ally, the belief that everyone else accepts it. When silence breaks, authority is forced to respond. Even when power reacts with repression, the moral landscape has already shifted. The idea that resistance is possible has entered public consciousness and cannot be fully erased. History shows that even failed rebellions weaken silence. They leave behind memory, language, and precedent. Breaking silence does not guarantee justice, but it guarantees disruption. And disruption matters because silence is what allows systems to operate smoothly. In moments when silence shatters, history accelerates. Time feels compressed. Decisions that were unthinkable become unavoidable. Ordinary people discover agency they did not know they possessed. These moments reveal a hidden truth, that silence was never consent, but endurance mistaken for agreement. When endurance ends, history moves, not because rulers change, but because people do. And once silence has broken, it can never be restored to its original strength. It may return in new forms, but it returns knowing it can be broken again. This knowledge is history's quiet inheritance, passed from one rupture to the next, waiting beneath every long silence. Silence has a language even when no words are spoken. It communicates through absence, through hesitation, through what is consistently avoided rather than what is declared. In social and historical contexts, silence is never empty. It sends messages upward to power, outward to victims, and inward to the self. To those in authority, silence signals permission. It says that boundaries are holding, that resistance is minimal, and that continuation is safe. Power listens carefully to what is not challenged. When no objection appears, systems interpret quiet as consent, even if that consent was never given. To those who suffer, silence speaks differently. It communicates abandonment. It suggests that their pain is either invisible or unimportant. When witnesses remain quiet, they unintentionally confirm the isolation of the victim. Suffering becomes private even when it is public. This isolation deepens harm because it removes hope of interruption. Silence also speaks to the individual who remains quiet. It tells them a story about who they are. It frames withdrawal as prudence, calmness, or maturity. It reassures the self that staying silent is reasonable, that it avoids trouble, that it preserves balance. This internal dialogue is powerful because it protects identity. Silence allows people to feel moral without acting. This is why silence often feels peaceful, even when injustice continues. Language normally clarifies reality, but the language of silence distorts it. By saying nothing, people avoid naming harm, and unnamed harm is easier to tolerate. Over time, patterns of silence become readable. Every society develops an unspoken vocabulary. topics that should not be raised, questions that cause discomfort, truths that are acknowledged only indirectly. People learn this language instinctively. They sense when to stop talking, when to change subject, when to lower their voice. This fluency is rewarded with acceptance. Speaking the wrong truth at the wrong time marks one as dangerous or naive. The language of silence is enforced not through law, but through reaction, awkwardness, withdrawal, exclusion. These responses teach faster than punishment. They shape behavior quietly and efficiently. History shows that once silence becomes a shared language, it replaces dialogue. People communicate alignment through restraint rather than agreement. This creates the illusion of unity without understanding. In such environments, truth does not disappear. It goes underground. It survives in whispers, private thoughts, and delayed regret. The danger of the language of silence is not that it forbids speech, but that it redefines speech as unnecessary or inappropriate. When silence becomes the dominant language, meaning shifts, action feels excessive, questioning feels impolite, interruption feels immoral. This inversion allows systems to persist without defense, because nothing needs to be justified when nothing is said, and as long as silence continues to speak on everyone's behalf. History moves forward guided not by truth, but by what remains unspoken. Responsibility feels strongest when it is personal and immediate, but it weakens as distance and numbers grow. When harm is close and singular, people instinctively feel accountable. When harm becomes large, shared, or systemic, responsibility begins to dissolve. This is not a failure of morality, but a feature of human psychology. The mind struggles to hold obligation without a clear point of action. As situations expand, people stop asking, "What should I do?" and begin asking, "Who is supposed to handle this?" In that shift, responsibility moves away from the individual and into abstraction. It becomes someone else's role, somewhere else's duty, sometime later. This fragmentation is reinforced by structure. Modern and historical systems divide tasks, authority, and blame so thoroughly that no single person feels ownership of outcomes. Each role feels partial, limited, and therefore innocent. People tell themselves they are only a small part of a larger process, and small parts do not feel responsible for the direction of the whole. This belief is comforting because it reduces moral pressure. When responsibility is fragmented, inaction no longer feels like a choice. It feels like a condition. The individual becomes a function rather than an agent. This also changes how people remember events. When harm is later judged, people recall procedures, orders, contexts, and limitations rather than decisions. They remember constraints instead of opportunities to intervene. This memory protects identity but erases agency. Fragmentation also benefits power. When responsibility has no clear owner, it cannot be confronted. Systems do not need to defend themselves against accusations if no one can decide where to aim them. Blame circulates endlessly without landing. This circulation replaces accountability with discussion. People debate causes, analyze complexity, and acknowledge harm while remaining motionless. The longer this continues, the more normal it feels. Responsibility turns theoretical rather than practical. People know something is wrong, but feel that acting would be inappropriate, ineffective, or symbolic. This discouragement is subtle. It does not forbid action. It questions its usefulness. This doubt is enough to stop most intervention. History shows that large-scale injustice often persists, not because people agree with it, but because responsibility has been broken into pieces too small to carry weight. When everyone carries a fragment, no one carries the whole. And without the whole, there is no urgency. The fragmentation of responsibility allows systems to continue without conviction or cruelty, only with inertia. It teaches people that morality belongs to structures rather than selves. And as long as responsibility remains scattered, history continues not through decision, but through default. One of the strongest reasons people remain silent is not agreement, but relief. The relief of not being targeted, the relief of not being chosen, the quiet comfort of saying, "It didn't touch me." Avoiding punishment becomes a form of survival that feels intelligent rather than moral. When harm happens nearby but not directly to us, the absence of consequence feels like confirmation that silence works. The mind interprets safety as proof of correctness. If nothing bad happened to me, then my choice must have been reasonable. This logic is powerful because punishment is visible and immediate, while moral cost is delayed and abstract. People learn quickly that speaking carries risk, while silence often carries protection. This lesson is reinforced every time someone else is punished for disruption. When a speaker is isolated, fired, arrested, or shamed, observers do not need to be warned. They understand. The system does not have to punish everyone. It only has to punish visibly. Avoidance becomes instinctive. People begin to measure their words, then their actions, and eventually their thoughts around one central goal: do not become a target. In this environment, silence feels like control. The phrase, "It didn't touch me," carries a hidden meaning. It suggests that harm is only real when it is personal, and that responsibility begins only when pain crosses a private boundary. This creates a moral perimeter around the self. Everything outside it becomes optional. Over time, this perimeter hardens. People stop seeing injustice as a shared condition and start seeing it as a series of individual misfortunes. This fragmentation protects emotional comfort, but it also protects systems of harm. The comfort of avoidance is deceptive because it feels like peace, but it is actually distance. Distance from risk, distance from consequence, distance from conscience. This distance allows people to live alongside injustice without feeling complicit. They are not cruel, they are careful, they are not indifferent, they are relieved. This relief is rewarded daily with stability, routine, and social acceptance. The cost is subtle and cumulative. Each time someone says, "At least it wasn't me," they reinforce a world where harm is tolerated as long as it remains selective. History shows that systems rarely collapse because everyone is punished. They endure because punishment is precise. It teaches silence without requiring mass violence. The comfort of not being touched becomes a silent contract. As long as I stay quiet, I remain safe. This contract feels fair until the boundary moves, and it always does. When it does, people are often surprised. They believed silence was protection. They forget that silence only delays attention. It does not eliminate it. This is the final danger of comfort. It convinces people that safety is permanent when it is merely conditional. And by the time the harm arrives at their door, the habits of silence are already too strong to break. If everyone is silent, freedom becomes an abstraction rather than a lived reality. It exists in language, in theory, in celebration, but not in practice. Freedom does not disappear when people are silent. It changes shape. It stops belonging to the many and begins serving the few. When silence becomes the norm, freedom shifts upward. It becomes something granted, managed, or permitted rather than exercised. People may still speak of freedom, but they speak of it carefully, indirectly, as something fragile that must not be disturbed. In this condition, freedom no longer protects expression. It protects order. The paradox is subtle but powerful. A society can claim freedom while discouraging its use. People are free in principle, but restrained in behavior. They learn where freedom ends, not through law, but through consequence. Those who test it face isolation or punishment, and the lesson spreads faster than any rule. When everyone is silent, freedom becomes selective. It is available to those with protection, status, or distance from risk. For others, it remains theoretical. This creates a divided reality where freedom exists, but only for those who can afford its cost. The rest are free, only to remain quiet. This silence reshapes desire. People stop wanting freedom as action and begin wanting it as security. They redefine freedom as the absence of trouble rather than the presence of choice. This redefinition is crucial because it aligns freedom with comfort rather than responsibility. When freedom is no longer exercised, it atrophies like an unused muscle. People forget what it feels like to speak without calculating consequence. They forget that freedom is not a condition granted by systems, but a practice sustained by participation. In silence, freedom becomes symbolic rather than functional. It is displayed but not used, celebrated but not trusted. This is why silence is so effective. It does not openly oppose freedom, it empties it. When no one speaks, freedom serves those who do not need to speak to remain powerful. It serves those whose position is secure enough that silence benefits them. The uncomfortable truth is this: freedom cannot belong to a silent majority. It belongs either to those who speak or to those who are protected from needing to. When everyone is silent, freedom becomes decoration. It reassures without empowering. It promises without delivering. And over time, people stop asking whether they are free and begin asking whether they are safe. This is the final exchange. Safety replaces freedom and silence becomes the price. Once that price feels reasonable, freedom no longer needs to be taken away. It is simply left unused. And a freedom that is never used slowly stops being real at all. Freedom is often imagined as an individual possession, something a person holds privately and exercises alone. But history suggests a different truth. Freedom is not sustained by isolated individuals. It is sustained by shared behavior. It exists only when enough people are willing to practice it together. When freedom is exercised by one person in isolation, it appears as defiance or risk. When it is exercised by many, it becomes normal. The collective condition of freedom lies in this difference. Freedom does not fail because people do not desire it. It fails because they attempt to hold it alone. In societies where silence dominates, individual freedom becomes fragile because every act of expression stands exposed. When no one else speaks, the speaker absorbs all the risk. This concentration of risk discourages action and turns freedom into a liability rather than a right. But when expression is shared, consequence disperses. Fear weakens because it no longer knows where to land. This is why freedom has always depended on collective participation. Even the most celebrated individual acts of courage only mattered because others followed, echoed, or protected them. Freedom requires witnesses who become participants. It requires repetition to become durable. When people retreat into private freedom, believing they are free as long as they think freely or live quietly, freedom shrinks. It becomes internal rather than social. This internal freedom may preserve dignity, but it cannot change conditions. External freedom depends on shared interruption. It depends on many people refusing the same limits at the same time. When this coordination is absent, systems adapt. They allow private belief while controlling public behavior. People are free to think, but not to act freely. This separation creates the illusion of freedom without its substance. The collective condition of freedom is also psychological. People must believe that others will not abandon them when they act. This belief does not require certainty. It requires trust, and trust cannot form in silence. Silence prevents coordination by keeping people unaware of shared discontent. When everyone doubts they are alone, they remain alone. Freedom waits behind this doubt. History shows that moments of expanded freedom always followed the same pattern. Shared recognition followed by shared action. Once people realized their restraint was collective rather than individual, the cost of acting dropped dramatically. Freedom became possible not because power weakened, but because isolation ended. This reveals the central condition. Freedom is not a state granted from above. It is a relationship maintained among equals. It survives only when people are willing to carry it together. When individuals attempt to carry it alone, it collapses under pressure. When they carry it collectively, it redistributes risk and multiplies strength. This is why silence is freedom's greatest enemy. Not because it forbids liberty, but because it prevents coordination. A silent society may contain free individuals, but it cannot sustain freedom as a reality. Freedom lives in shared refusal, shared voice, and shared presence. Without these, it becomes a private feeling rather than a public condition. And a freedom that exists only privately can be ignored publicly until it disappears without being taken. Individual freedom is often described as something a person can possess alone, independent of others, protected internally even when the outside world is constrained. But history and psychology suggest that this idea is largely an illusion. Freedom practiced alone does not remain freedom for long. It becomes isolation, adaptation, or quiet withdrawal. True freedom requires a social environment in which expression, choice, and refusal are not punished by abandonment. When only one person acts freely while others remain silent, that person is not free. They are exposed. All risk concentrates on them, and concentrated risk turns freedom into vulnerability. This is why individual freedom collapses under pressure. When no one else shares the burden, freedom becomes unsustainable. The individual may still think freely, but thought without expression has no power. The individual may still choose privately, but private choice does not alter public conditions. This creates a dangerous misunderstanding. People tell themselves they are free because they can think what they want, while their behavior is shaped entirely by fear of consequence. This is not freedom. It is internal refuge. Freedom that cannot be acted upon is not freedom in practice. It is endurance with dignity. History shows that isolated freedom is always temporary. It survives only until it attracts attention. Once noticed, it is either suppressed or forced back into silence. This is why systems tolerate individual deviation, but resist collective expression. One person can be ignored, many cannot. When freedom is attempted alone, it appears abnormal or disruptive. But when freedom is shared, it appears legitimate. Time has a quiet way of softening judgment, especially for those who chose silence. When events move forward without immediate consequence, inaction begins to look reasonable rather than cowardly. The longer nothing happens, the easier it becomes to believe that nothing needed to be done. Time creates distance, and distance reshapes memory. What once felt like a moral crossroads slowly turns into a vague moment with blurred alternatives. People stop remembering what was possible and begin remembering only what occurred. This shift is crucial because responsibility depends on remembering choice. When time erases the sense of choice, silence starts to look inevitable rather than selected. Another way time justifies silence is through normalization. What continues without interruption begins to feel correct in hindsight. If a system survives for years or decades, people assume it must have been stable, necessary, or unavoidable. This assumption retroactively excuses those who did not resist. It suggests that resistance would have been futile, and futility becomes moral cover. Time also rewards outcomes, not intentions. If history moves on without visible collapse, those who stayed quiet can claim realism. They can say they adapted wisely, that they understood the world as it was, that they avoided pointless sacrifice. This narrative gains strength as consequences fade. Suffering that was once visible becomes abstract. Once victims disappear from daily life, the urgency of past silence disappears with them. Time also reorganizes blame. It shifts focus from individual behavior to historical forces, economic pressures, or cultural norms. These explanations are not false, but they dilute personal accountability. They transform silence into context rather than decision. As years pass, people begin to speak of that era as if it acted on its own. This language removes human agency and replaces it with inevitability. Time further protects silence by exhausting emotion. Outrage cannot be sustained indefinitely. When anger fades, what remains is fatigue, and fatigue prefers peace over reckoning. In this emotional quiet, those who remain silent feel vindicated. They survived, they endured, and survival is easily mistaken for wisdom. The most powerful justification time offers is comparison. When worse events follow, earlier silence looks minor by contrast. People say it could have been worse, and therefore conclude that silence helped prevent disaster. This logic ignores what was lost, but it comforts those who wish to feel innocent. Over time, silence is reframed as patience, caution, or maturity. This reframing allows people to integrate their inaction into a coherent self-image. They no longer see themselves as someone who failed to act, but as someone who understood limits. This is how time becomes an ally of silence. It does not erase facts, it rearranges meaning. By the time history is written, the urgency that once demanded action has vanished. What remains is outcome without tension, result without dilemma. In that version of events, silence appears justified because the cost of acting can no longer be felt. But this justification is fragile. It depends on forgetting that at the moment of silence, the future was unknown and responsibility was real. Time may excuse silence, but it cannot prove it was right. It can only make it easier to live with, and history, shaped by memory rather than possibility, often accepts this comfort as truth. Memory is not a neutral record of the past. It is an adaptive process that protects identity as much as it preserves facts. When people look back on moments of silence, they rarely remember the tension of choice. They remember the comfort of belonging. This is where selective memory begins. Uncomfortable details fade first. The doubts, the hesitations, the moments when action felt possible slowly disappear. What remains is a simplified narrative that events unfolded naturally and that individual decisions mattered little. This simplification creates one of history's most common excuses. Everyone was doing it. The phrase sounds descriptive, but it functions defensively. It shifts responsibility from the self to the crowd, transforming choice into inevitability. When people say everyone was doing it, they are not claiming approval. They are claiming absence of alternatives. This claim is rarely accurate, even when it feels true at the time. Selective memory removes evidence of dissent, exception, and possibility. It forgets those who spoke quietly, those who resisted briefly, those who hesitated longer than others. By erasing these variations, memory creates the illusion of total conformity. This illusion is comforting because it dissolves guilt. If no one acted, then no one could have acted. If silence was universal, then silence was reasonable. Time strengthens this process. As years pass, people begin to remember the dominant behavior as the only behavior. The fact that some people acted differently becomes inconvenient and is quietly ignored. The excuse, everyone was doing it, also benefits from repetition. When many people use it, it gains legitimacy. It becomes a shared explanation that requires no further examination. This collective agreement stabilizes memory around a single narrative and discourages deeper questioning. To challenge the excuse would require reopening old uncertainties, and uncertainty threatens self-coherence. Selective memory also reframes morality. People remember outcomes rather than intentions. They recall survival rather than compromise. They tell themselves they acted like any reasonable person would have under the circumstances. This framing transforms silence into prudence and conformity into realism. The danger of this memory pattern is that it teaches future silence. By rewriting the past as unavoidable, it prepares the mind to accept the next moment of inaction as equally inevitable. History becomes a sequence of no-choice moments, even though each one contained options that were simply not taken. The phrase, "everyone was doing it," does more than excuse the past. It trains the future. It reassures people that blending in is wisdom and that standing apart is unnecessary. This reassurance is powerful because it feels social rather than moral. It aligns the self with the group and shields identity from scrutiny. But history does not move because everyone does the same thing. Moves because some do not. Selective memory hides this truth by smoothing out difference and flattening responsibility. When memory forgets choice, it forgets agency. And when agency is forgotten, silence becomes easier to repeat. Not because it is right, but because it no longer feels like a decision at all. History often celebrates movements, but movements almost always begin with a single person who breaks the silence first. This individual rarely intends to become symbolic. They usually act out of necessity rather than ambition. The moment of breaking silence is not dramatic from the inside. It feels lonely, uncertain, and dangerous. The individual who speaks first does so without knowing whether anyone will follow. This is what makes the act distinct. It is not supported by numbers, consensus, or safety. It exists before validation. History later frames these individuals as courageous or visionary, but at the moment of action, they are simply exposed. They carry all the risk because silence has not yet fractured. Power reacts strongly to first voices because they threaten the most fragile illusion that everyone agrees or at least accepts. The first speaker reveals that silence was never universal, only shared out of fear. This revelation is destabilizing. It invites others to reconsider their own restraint. That is why early speakers are often targeted quickly and harshly. The goal is not only to punish, but to restore silence by example. Yet history shows that once silence is broken, even briefly, it cannot be fully repaired. The idea that speaking is possible enters collective awareness and lingers. Even when the first individual is silenced, others have seen the crack. The role of the first speaker is therefore paradoxical. They are often defeated personally, but successful historically. They rarely benefit from the change they initiate. They pay the cost up front so that others may act later at lower risk. This delayed impact is why such individuals are frequently misunderstood. They appear ineffective in their own time because results do not follow immediately. But history measures influence differently. It traces shifts in possibility rather than instant outcomes. The first speaker changes what can be imagined. They turn private doubt into public potential. This transformation is subtle but irreversible. The presence of a single dissenting voice disproves the belief that silence is natural. It reveals it as conditional. When people later act collectively, they often forget the first voice. They remember the movement, the crowd, the turning point. But without the initial breach, none of these would have occurred. The individual who breaks silence stands at the most dangerous position in history, between isolation and contagion. They absorb fear before it spreads. They hold responsibility before it distributes. This is why such individuals are rare. Not because people lack conscience, but because the cost of being first is highest. History does not move forward evenly. It advances through these uneven moments where one person interrupts continuity without guarantee of success. The first voice does not need to be loud. It needs to exist, and once it does, silence is no longer absolute. It becomes something that can be challenged, shared, and eventually overcome. This is the quiet power of the individual who breaks silence. They do not change history by force. They change it by making speech possible. The idea of a normal person feels natural, as if it emerged organically from human behavior. But history shows that normality is constructed rather than discovered. No one is born knowing what normal is. They learn it through repetition, reward, and consequence. Normality forms where behavior is measured, compared, and quietly ranked. It is not defined by truth or morality, but by predictability. A normal person is not necessarily a good person. A normal person is a manageable one. This distinction matters because systems do not require virtue to function. They require consistency. Throughout history, those with power defined normality by deciding which behaviors caused no disruption. Speech that questioned order was labeled extreme. Actions that challenged hierarchy were labeled abnormal. Silence, adaptation, and obedience were framed as maturity and realism. This framing did not need to be announced. It was absorbed through social cues. People observed who advanced, who remained safe, and who disappeared. Normality revealed itself through outcome, not instruction. Over time, being normal came to mean staying within invisible boundaries. These boundaries shifted with context, but their purpose remained the same: to separate acceptable behavior from risky deviation. The question, "Who is normal?" quietly replaced the question, "What is right?" This replacement is crucial because it moves morality from principle to consensus. When normality becomes the standard, people stop asking whether something should be done and begin asking whether it will make them stand out. This fear of standing out disciplines behavior more effectively than force ever could. The normal person becomes someone who senses limits before they are enforced, someone who adjusts instinctively, someone who knows when to stop speaking. Normality is taught early. Children learn it in classrooms where curiosity is rewarded only when it stays within structure. Courage rarely arrives at the moment it is most needed. It almost always comes later, after damage has been done, after lines have hardened, after silence has already shaped outcomes. This delay is not accidental. It is built into how people assess risk and responsibility. Courage requires the belief that action is still meaningful, and that belief weakens over time. When uncertainty is high, people hesitate. They wait for clarity, for confirmation, for signs that acting will not be wasted. This waiting feels prudent, but it quietly postpones courage into irrelevance. The mind tells itself that caution is wisdom and that timing matters. But timing becomes an excuse when fear remains unresolved. People do not delay courage because they lack values. They delay it because values compete with survival. Speaking early carries the highest risk and the lowest guarantee of success. Late courage feels safer because outcomes are clearer and numbers are larger. When many others finally speak, the individual cost decreases. This creates a tragic pattern. Courage becomes socially acceptable only when it is no longer decisive. History remembers brave words spoken after the turning point, but forgets the silence that allowed the turning point to form. Delayed courage often appears in the form of confession rather than intervention. People speak once the danger has passed, once power has shifted, once speaking no longer threatens belonging. This version of courage is emotionally satisfying but historically limited. It acknowledges wrong without undoing it. Another reason courage arrives late is moral exhaustion. Prolonged exposure to injustice without agency drains energy. When people finally act, it is often because endurance has collapsed rather than because conviction has strengthened. This collapse produces urgency but not precision. Actions taken under exhaustion lack the timing that earlier intervention required. Courage also depends on imagination. People must be able to picture a different outcome before they risk themselves. When systems appear permanent, early courage feels foolish. Late courage benefits from hindsight. Once change seems possible, courage feels reasonable. This retroactive rationality hides the fact that possibility only exists because someone acted earlier without assurance. Delayed courage is therefore derivative. It builds on the risks others already absorbed. History often praises courage without acknowledging its timing. This distorts the lesson. It teaches people that bravery will always find its moment when in reality moments close. Courage that arrives too late may still heal conscience, but it rarely changes trajectory. The uncomfortable truth is that the most effective courage is the least visible. It happens before permission, before consensus, and before safety. It looks unreasonable at the time and unnecessary afterward. This is why it is so rare. People prefer courage that confirms reality rather than challenges it. But history does not move when courage agrees with the moment. It moves when courage interrupts it. And interruption is most dangerous when silence still feels tolerable. That is the moment courage is needed most, and the moment it is least likely to appear.